Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, alcohol, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bite Size Balance. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today because today I get the pleasure of sitting down with somebody I really admire as a coach and a friend of mine, Scott Pinyard. So Scott is the owner and coach at Modern Coparent, which is a company dedicated to helping people find peace co-parenting. And he has years of coaching experience as the head coach of This Naked Mind and in his own private coaching practice. Scott's focus is in helping people through challenging growth with compassion, patience, and humor. And we're going to talk today about some of the common challenges in co-parenting. And I have a feeling Scott's going to provide us with just a really fresh perspective on how to get unstuck and make change and create a reality where we're co-parenting in a way that just feels much more resonant and fulfilling for us. I just have a feeling this podcast is going to be really helpful to a lot of listeners. If it's not you, but it's your sister or it's a friend, I really encourage you to forward this podcast on to them if you think it will be helpful to them. So without further ado, here is my friend and fellow coach, Scott Pinyard. Hello, Scott Pinyard.
Hello, Wendy. How are you?
I'm so good. I was saying to you before I hit record that I was like really looking forward to seeing your face this morning because it's one of those days where I just needed a friendly face. So, and yours is so friendly. If you're not watching this by video, guys, Scott has this like amazing big beard and this big smile, and then always wears really cool colored glasses. So today they're blue.
I might have to dye my beard. It's starting to get very, very gray. It like doesn't show up on camera as well as it used to.
No, man, it's like you've got Santa Claus vibe going. You can't mess with that.
My kids are very excited for like 5 years from now when I get to do that.
Okay, so I'm excited to have you here, Scott, because we're going to talk about a topic that I really know nothing about. I certainly have like people who are close to me who are struggling with co-parenting right now after divorce or separation, but I don't have any experience of my own personally with it. And so, but it comes up a lot in my practice. And, you know, I think it's obviously a very common area of challenge for parents. And you have not only your own story around this, but you coach in this area. And so you're going to have, I've already kind of just, set the stage for you, providing us with some really great insights today. So no pressure.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with just like, how did you, because, of course, as I said in the introduction, you used to work at This Naked Mind and now you're working, you've switched your kind of focus in your coaching practice. Yeah. How did you decide this was something that you had an interest in, wanted to coach around? And what's your personal story that connects to this?
So interestingly, not a lot of people know this, but before I started coaching people around alcohol, I was helping people with divorce, or that's what I was calling it, helping people kind of manage their way through that divorce process. And so this has been something to me that's really important. And the reason is that I went through this myself back in, I guess it was 2011. My wife and I separated and then initiated divorce proceedings. And then I was on this journey for so long with trying to figure out how to operate in this co-parenting world. And I learned a lot along the way. And I, in the same way that I did with alcohol, where it took me years to like get to a point where I was comfortable with it, same thing happened with co-parenting. Fast forward to now, my co-parent and I are good friends. As a matter of fact, they're involved with this company. Like when I'm putting content and everything together, they're right there with me. And we're talking through it and talking through our own journeys. And everyone will be hearing from them at Modern Coparent soon. But I began to realize that, as I was coaching more people, particularly in the alcohol arena, this comes up a lot, right? And then I look around, my kids are 12, 8, and 16 months. So my oldest, my 12-year-old is the one that is going between homes. And I talk to like friends who are divorced and, people here in the neighborhood and in the school. And I just hear so much stress and anger. Mm-hmm. And I don't have that anymore, but it took me a long time to get to a place where I could actually like peacefully coexist with my co-parent. And actually, I've gone well beyond that. And honestly, the Scott of like 6 years ago would be telling you you're crazy if you were to say, hey, Scott in 2023 is actually friends with his co-parent. As a matter of fact, they've started a company together. I would have had some very choice 4-letter words to say about that. But that was the process I was on. And so I've kind of recognized that there is a way for us as individuals to feel peace. And that's what I do at Modern Coparent. I don't give legal advice or financial advice or custody advice. I mean, there's plenty of resources for that. What I help people with is the way that they feel, because, in my experience, I tell this story all the time in my courses where, I remember getting like my phone buzzing and it was a text message from my co-parent. And before I even saw the message, before I read what they had to say, I was like pissed, right? Like my blood pressure would go through the roof. And then of course I'd inevitably read it. And the vast majority of the time it was like, hey, Jane forgot her boots. I'll drop them off later. And that was a pattern that was creating a lot of stress and anxiety in my life. And what I was able to do, and what I now help other people do, is shift the way they think about things so that they can create more peace in their life. Because ultimately, the concern that most people have in a co-parenting situation are the kids. Right. And so what I try to help people do is develop peace so that they can be more present and better parents. And then this extends also to their relationship with their co-parent. The way that I like to sum it up is that, I remember growing up, I had friends whose parents were divorced. My parents are still together, but I had a lot of friends whose parents were divorced. And it was always this like nasty, acrimonious situation, and that is old-fashioned co-parenting. Modern co-parenting is where you are a whole individual and can interact with another whole individual in this new phase of your life. And so that's why I called the company what I did. This isn't about like how to hurt them or how to just put up with them until the kid's 18. This is about, man, there's actually maybe some personal work I can do here so that I feel better. And in turn, I'm a better parent and can relate to my co-parent in a better way.
That's awesome. I've seen this trend. I don't want to call it a trend. That's not right. But like, I agree with you. When I was a kid, most of the examples that I had around what it looked like to have divorced parents were not very positive, and kind of, toxic and really hard on the kids. Yeah. And I just seen through, again, my own friends and family, how they're doing it. And it's just completely different. I mean, my sister and her husband co-parented for a long time before they actually physically separated, but they were separated, and it actually worked really, really well for the kids and for them. So I've watched that work, and I just think it's really cool. All of these new ways of thinking about this, these new options for parents that are out there. As you were chatting, I thought of something. We're probably going to come back to this, but I don't like to lose questions. Do you normally work with one co-parent, both co-parents, or could it be either of those as a coach?
So that's a great question. And actually, my whole thing is set up to only work with one of the co-parents. And there's a few reasons for that. Yeah. First, what I have found in my experience, but as well in coaching all the people I've coached through this, is it only takes one person to shift the way they're thinking and operating for the entire relationship dynamic to change. And so, in my experience, what happened with me is I realized, like, man, with my co-parent, I was not even necessary. I was viewing them as like a nasty chore I had to put up with. Sorry, Ray, if you hear this, but like, that's how I saw it. And it wasn't until I made a conscious decision to say, hey, let's get together. I set up coffee like every other week, and we couldn't talk about our daughter, that I started to see them as a person. And I started to relax, they started to relax, and the whole thing shifted. Right. And so, first of all, this work really only needs to happen on one side. Second, we go into some tough stuff. Well, you know me as a coach. I like to go like right at the difficult
You
stuff.
like to go deep. Scott likes to go deep.
I do. And so the idea of putting a divorced couple on a call with me that are already in the middle of another fight and then ask them to be vulnerable and go deep. I mean, you can imagine how that would go. So everything that I do, from the one-on-one coaching to the group stuff, which will be available hopefully in the next couple of months here, all of that stuff is designed for one person to go through.
Yeah.
And we talk about not only like your own stories and the way you see things, but also how to operate and deal with someone that's operating from a different place.
Yeah, that's great. So what are some of the common challenges that you see in co-parenting? I mean, the types of things that come up probably regularly in your coaching practice.
So the biggest things that I see people, coming to a coaching call and being upset about, money is a big one, right? So especially at first when you're dividing everything up, there's a lot wrapped around the idea of how do we divide assets, how do we kind of deal with that. Second big one, they're probably equally as big, is custody, right? So who's gonna get the kids? How is that gonna work out? How do we do it? And then third, and this is really interesting, this sounds kind of crazy what I'm about to say, but it's totally true. So divorce, the breakup of a relationship, is actually a fantastically fertile time for personal development. The problem is it's very painful. And so the third thing that I see coming up a lot tends to be something around ourselves and the sort of shame or guilt that we feel about being in the situation. And I know that that's kind of vague, but it is truly different for other people. For me, in going through this, I learned a lot about myself the hard way through divorce. And a lot of people are in that boat.
Yeah. And just curious, is alcohol one of the things that sometimes comes out in terms of people making change around behaviors that aren't serving them?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I see alcohol ends up being a coping mechanism very often.
Sure.
And there's obviously a lot of overlap between alcohol coaching and co-parent. And I still take on one-on-one alcohol clients. It's something that's important to me that I think I'll always do, but my focus right now is on co-parenting. But yeah, so the sort of coping mechanisms that we use, the sort of ways that we process, which is like a really big deal, right? For like, you think of a divorce being something where, you're moving out, like that's the end of a relationship. It's a big change for the kids. Like it's a massive, massive thing. And so alcohol, I don't want to say always, but very, very often has a big role in that.
Yeah,
Part.
Yeah, I see it for sure. Like it transitions generally I mostly work with women, as you know, but when women are going through transitions, big transitions, and obviously separation and divorce is a huge transition, that it's often the time when alcohol ramps up for them, becomes problematic. So yeah, I can totally see that. This is a question like one coach to another. When you're working with coaching clients, I think I know the answer, but I don't want to put it in your mouth. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Who's setting the goals, and what are the goals?
I love that.
When someone's working with you.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because a lot of people will come to me and it's like some version of like, how do I live with this a-hole? Right? Like it's some way of saying that, maybe with swearing, maybe with not, but it's really interesting. I thought a lot about it as I was getting going and doing this. And I recognize that the real goal here isn't about being best friends with a co-parent, right? It's not about, like, we hear these stories of people, I bought a duplex with my ex and they live on one side and I live on the other. Like, that is not a requirement, right? As a matter of fact, like, you got divorced for a reason. And so you like living your own life, and them living their own life is a really good thing. So I was really thinking about, well, what is the goal? Like, what is it that can actually help people enjoy their lives more? And it's remarkably simple. The goal, and what everything I do at Modern Coparent, is about helping co-parents cultivate peace in their life.
Yeah.
And it's not this idea of like a perfect blissful peace. It's this idea of like, is it better now than it was a week ago? Is it better now than it was a month ago? Because the more that we develop that peace for ourselves, the less that we're in our own head having our, imaginary arguments with I should have said this sort of thing, the more present we can be for our kids, the better we feel, the better community members we are. And shockingly, the more peace we can develop with our own story and situation, the better and more effectively we can communicate with our co-parent. And that's really the goal, is how do we cultivate peace in this relationship for one person? And once one person starts to do that, so many things can change.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. And in the process of creating the peace, are your clients often creating, there's obviously the peace with the other co-parent, so actually the relationship with the other co-parent and peacefulness there, but is there also a piece of the coaching you do, keep using the word piece, a part of the coaching that you do that is really focused on dealing with other parts of that client's life that are not feeling peaceful right now? Or are you focusing mostly on the relationship dynamics and the level of peace there? Does that question make sense?
It makes a ton of sense.
Okay.
But the answer is no, I don't actually. We will talk about that stuff.
Yeah.
But this whole thing revolves around the idea of story. And so just for like a little digression, when I say story, what I'm talking about is sort of the world that we live in. So you take in information through your senses, and then our senses are imperfect, right? And so we're always making assumptions, right? We're always trying to do things because our brains want to make sense. They want to make meaning of what's happening. So we take in imperfect information and then we kind of fill in the gaps, right? And so in a sense, we live inside of our stories. Right? Our stories are how we experience the world. And when something massive happens, like a divorce, we're creating stories left and right. And so, what I actually focus on with people is not necessarily, although we do discuss this from time to time, not necessarily tactics on how to interact with your co-parent. That stuff is, I think, helpful, but a little bit superficial. Where I want to go is I want to talk about their stories, about the relationship, about what happened, about themselves. And I want to help them shift those stories. Because if you're getting divorced, because of, just make up a reason, right? Like, let's say a husband has a drinking problem, maybe, It's very easy, and we see this with alcohol all the time, for people to be like, oh, well, he just doesn't love me enough to quit drinking.
Right.
And that's a story, and that's very real for some people. But what I will do is I have tools and processes to help people look at that a little bit differently. Because if you can shift that away from he doesn't love me enough to quit drinking into, wow, he's really stuck, or wow, this isn't his fault, right? A lot of what we do with alcohol, that changes the way that the person feels. So as an example, I was working with someone once who was dealing with, it's hard to tell. I don't know for sure if it was substance abuse or mental illness, but there was a ton of blame, right? And that, like, oh, she just won't get the treatment that she needs, and she knows she has to do this, and on and on and on. And in working through those stories, and like having this person I was working with write these stories out, look at those gaps, and then use some tools to change perspective. This person, even though they were going through a divorce and it was nasty and it was intense, was actually able to develop compassion for their co-parent.
Right.
And compassion doesn't mean that you have to love the person. It doesn't mean that you have to be best friends, but that compassion made him feel better. And that's what I'm after, right? Because I know that as co-parents, if we're in a better place, we're healthier, then we're better parents, and we're better, better co-parents. Does that make sense? I feel like,
oh my gosh. Yeah, no, that makes total sense to me. And I'm just curious, the thing I love about perspective as a coaching tool and helping people to shift perspective is that it doesn't always require you to disprove the original story. So you don't need to prove to yourself, whether that it's wrong, for example, that this person didn't love you enough. I mean, obviously that could be helpful, but you don't need to do that. And sometimes it takes time for people to be able to shift those big stories, in my experience.
Yeah.
And so instead you can find something that is equally true or truer.
Yeah.
And kind of consciously choose. And this is really where the power is, I think, as humans here, to step into that and say, this is where I'm going to try to, in this case, I assume, sort of parent from and relate from to this co-parent.
Exactly. Yeah. I start off, when I work with people, is we start with the really burning, intense fears that people have. My divorce is going to mess up my kids. My co-parent, they're going to like my co-parent more, right? There are certain things that we all struggle with when we go through this. But I ask, and you've heard me say this before too, like, what's the most painful thought you have? Because that's the place to start. And so what we do is, we work on story from that place. To overuse the word peace, I like to say peace is made piece by piece, right? Yeah. So like we take these individual thoughts and we shift them. So like starting with something really painful, like, this divorce is going to irrevocably mess up my kids. That is not a helpful thought. That is a painful thought. And every time you think that, you're impacting the way you feel and the way you continue to create story. And so I'll often start with people on those more difficult ones, the more painful ones that are generally a little bit easier to shift. And then, these like larger narratives start to appear. So one of the things that we do, and this is in the later course, is we actually look at the entire relationship narrative from beginning to end. And it helps to give people perspective once they're used to using the story tool and shift. But you're totally right. Like, I don't have one coaching session with people and have them go, oh yeah, everything's fine. I have compassion for them. It's a process. And then, in terms of like parenting, like deciding how you want to show up and parent, that's something else we do in the first course after we kind of go through some of these exercises and start to shift perspective, is we put together co-parenting principles. And the idea here, and it's just for us, it's not for our co-parent, but excuse me, the idea here is that based on what you're learning, these are the ways that you want to show up. They're really meant to be achievable, but also aspirational. And it gives people this yardstick and this way to kind of look at, all right, how am I relating with my co-parent? How am I relating with my kids? That's really rooted in the direction we want to go, as opposed to sort of reacting emotionally, which is what so many people do in this situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. Okay, I got another question for you. I think I know the answer to, but I'm often wrong. So let me ask you this, because I'm genuinely
not my
curious.
Experience, by the way.
Well, here's the thing. The thing is that I'm obviously trained in kind of a model of coaching and an approach, and it's the same model and approach that you're trained in. And we both have our other backgrounds that inform how we coach, but that's why I feel like I might know the answer to this, but listeners probably don't. And so I'm curious about this. And that is how much of an experiment mindset is required in terms of like working through these things. And what I mean by that, if that is fuzzy for you, is like, is there an aspect of this approach to coaching around co-parenting where you're asking people to stay aware and mindful and pay attention to how these things that they're working on are actually changing the way they feel, changing the way they behave? Does that make sense?
Yes. And that is absolutely part of it, but there's a step before that.
Okay.
So in my initial course, actually, I talk a lot about this idea, and I'm in love with the idea of like thoughts and story being like how we experience our life. Mm-hmm. I sound so crazy when I say that sometimes, but one of the things that I will regularly have people do is track the thoughts that they're having about their co-parent, the co-parenting situation, and look at those thoughts and how it makes them feel.
Right.
One thing that humans, and I know I wasn't raised this way, like this was a big, like massive insight for me when I got older, but I don't think we recognize how much control we actually have over how we feel. And I introduce that topic as we go through the process, But the very first thing before we even talk about that is I do have people keep track of their thoughts about their co-parent, write it down and write down how it feels. And then as we start shifting these stories, right, as we start changing perspective a little bit, that leads to different thoughts, and then they compare that. And so in that sense, yeah, like it is an idea of experiment in terms of like, hey, this is how it used to feel, this is how it feels now. Which do you prefer?
Yeah.
And, you know, longer term, and like other courses that I'm working on are go a little bit deeper into that. And how do we actually create the sort of experience that we want to live? Which I know you do and I do as well, in terms of cultivating our thoughts and like looking at like our bigger sort of stories around the world. Through changing all of that, you can truly, truly change the way you experience your life. But I often find that people need to mindfully experience the crappy part before they like get to like, all right, I'm going to move forward.
Totally makes sense. I'm thinking of like the pause in the TNM methodology,
totally,
where we get people to just not worry too much about changing the way they're drinking for a while, so that they can learn everything they need to learn about their existing relationship and how that's making them feel and the thoughts that they're having there. So that's really cool. This is so great. I just love the fact that you know, that I'm just reflecting on how versatile coaching is, and how how these commonalities that underlie coaching for most of us, how we can take those and we can support a really specific population or client with a really specific problem. So I love this. I think this is great. What are some of the common stories that you hear? Like, are there common stories, or is that not a good question? I don't know.
It's a fine question. I hear lots of different stories. There tend to be a few major categories that they fall in. So it might be easier to talk about it that way.
Sure.
Very often I hear a lot of stories making the co-parent wrong. Right. And so that could be he did this, she did this sort of thing. So that's a big one. And inside of that will be like, they're wrong in terms of how they treated me. They're wrong in terms of how they treated the kids. They're wrong in terms of how whatever choices they made. So that's a big one. Another really big category, and honestly, this one may even be bigger than like, there's something wrong with my co-parent, are stories about ourselves. And so, you know, no one gets married saying this is a giant mistake. You know, like we all, you know, like when we're there, I hope not, at least. You might think it ahead of time. That's one thing. But like, you know, you go through it with the intent of going through it, you know, and then life has a way of showing you like, you know, here are some things that aren't working, I guess. And so what tends to happen is we develop stories about ourselves around, you know, that we did something wrong, or that we were acting in a wrong way, or that this always happens to me. And so that's another really big category. And that's why I often say that, you know, divorce is not the preferred method, but definitely a like really good launching off point for personal growth. So there's a lot of stories about the co-parent and what went down. There's a lot of stories about ourselves. And then I think probably the most painful one are the stories about the kids. We would do anything for our kids. And when something really big like this happens, and we can, you know, kind of forecast or kind of see that there could be some intense ramifications for them, people really develop stories really quickly. And there's a ton of future tripping, right? There's a ton of like, oh, my kid's gonna have a miserable time now because they're going between houses, or, you know, my kid's not gonna see, you know, now they're gonna think divorce is the way that you should handle, you know, marital problems. And there are just so many stories around that. And a big part of Modern Coparent is, and again, this is why it only takes one person, is to recognize those stories and try to shift them so that you feel a little bit more peace on being able to you know, interact with your kid. So there's a lot of future tripping around that. There's a lot of there's also a lot of worry, and maybe this is kind of between category 2 and 3. This is getting complicated. Oh no. Okay. But where it's like, oh, they're gonna like the co-parent more than me.
Right.
And it gets into this real like me versus them sort of thinking, which is another place. So, it's funny because just like with alcohol, there are like sort of repeating themes in the stories that people have, but those are really the main buckets: story about our co-parent, story about us, and then of course our stories about the kids.
Yeah. What if you have a situation, which I'm presuming this happens a lot, but what about the situation where one person is really into peaceful co-parenting, but the other person isn't?
Yes, I love it. It's a great question, because yes, this does happen. So what's really interesting about this, and like what I do at Modern, and you'll notice the name of the company is Modern Coparent, singular, not Modern Coparents, plural, because you don't have any control over what your co-parent does. And so you deciding to live in a certain way or think in a certain way may or may not actually have an impact on them. And expecting something to happen, expecting, them to live or operate in a certain way is a really great way to get yourself let down. And so what the aim of Modern Coparent is about giving the people in the programs the tools and ability to deal with someone no matter what their stories are. And we do a whole module on this in the second course, which is about like, all right, I'm starting to see my stories. How do I deal with someone with different stories? Well, you know what? Even from that starting point of saying, wait, I've got all of these stories that I'm living in, even that knowledge allows you to interact with someone who is not into, someone who's called a high conflict co-parent, in a totally different way. Because at the end of the day, if we show up and our co-parent is screaming at us and throwing things, I mean, just you think of like the most horrible stuff that can happen.
Yeah.
It's really up to us to decide how we want to respond and how much we want to let that affect us. In order to get there, you have to be clear about your stories. But yeah, that's my goal, is that like, I want, as an individual co-parent, someone to have those tools and abilities to deal with those really difficult situations.
Yeah. Do you ever find that as people are doing the work around their own stories, that shifts them into a place of more empathy for their co-parent, even if their co-parent isn't doing that work and is a higher conflict co-parent, just because they now realize that everybody has stories, I don't know.
Do not like talking about this publicly, because it's a great way to get people to not sign up for my course, is to say, hey, you're going to have compassion for your co-parent, because normally I get like a single digit response to that idea. But yes, Wendy. Yeah. And I mean, this is what happens, right? Like we start working through this process and we start to view, a lot of people are like, I am right, they're a jerk, right? That's where we start. And that is not reality. Can I swear on your podcast, by the way?
Yes, I'm supposed to do some kind of like trigger warning, let people know, but I feel like everyone who listens to this podcast knows, because we do it all the time. So go for it.
Okay, so I haven't been this whole time, but anyway, it's a really funny coincidence, Wendy, in that every single person I've met who's been divorced got divorced from an asshole. And weird how that worked. I just happened to be meeting the nice one, not the asshole. But my point is, like, this is the way that we view things really, really often. And you are 100% correct that as you start sort of like unpacking things for yourself, you're going to unpack. And we often start with like, they're a jerk, they did this, they did, like the easy, accessible stuff for us. But as we start kind of pulling those apart, we start to realize that we have our own stories. We get to a place where we're more vulnerable, and we can look at maybe some of the things that, we're not 100% proud of, or ways that we showed up, either not showing up for ourselves or the way that we interacted. And this leads to having compassion for your co-parent. And I know, like, if someone had told me that years ago, I would have been like, I want nothing to do with you. But the reality of the situation is that once we learn more about story, once we learn more about how we're constructing our reality, we can start to see other people doing it too. And there is a deep, when people really get this concept and start to shift stories, there is a deep feeling of empathy that starts to develop.
Yeah. And in my experience, as soon as we can start to develop that compassion and empathy for someone else, it just shifts us right out of blame and judgment and into like a completely different space, which presumably helps to diffuse the toxicity, whatever the anger and whatever is currently making this a really challenging co-parent situation.
So the idea is, that anger and that blame, like those are direct results of the stories that we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And as we start to shift those, and one thing that people start to realize again, like that they have so much more control over this, that they can start to see a situation that used to cause them a tremendous amount of, say, anger, right? You always do this, right? Something along those lines. When they start to kind of peel back the layers, they can see it not as like a personal attack on them or as something that honestly needs to raise their blood pressure, but they can start to see it as like, yeah, they're a human. I'm a human. Humans are messy. And when we can get to that level, and it's often buried under sometimes years and years of resentments and anger, and this is the stuff that we work through, you can ultimately get to a place where relating to them doesn't hurt anymore.
Yeah. Like, wow, wouldn't that just be so great? I'm thinking like, of all the people I know right now who are struggling with this and where it's gotten really emotional and really personal and really hurtful and is just robbing them of their peace and causing so much stress. It sounds awesome, Scott, honestly, as I'm listening.
My goal is to help people get there sooner.
Yeah.
I mean, I am in a lot of ways. I remember I was in court with my ex-wife, and we were going to re-up a custody thing. So this was years after we got divorced. And I remember looking at them and saying, I am really happy I got divorced from you. And that totally came out wrong, because what I did not mean like, I'm happy I divorced you. What I meant is like, I'm happy that like, that I was able to connect with them and they were able to see me with empathy. Like we were able to make that switch, because for the first 5-6 years, it was a lot of arguing. It was a lot of fighting. But I remember the first time I felt grateful for my co-parent, which sounds like a crazy thing to say, but that's how I know like, oh, like something had really shifted. And, there's this idea, and a lot of people, you will all hear these stories like, oh, I have holidays and go on vacations with my co-parent and we do all these things together. When you're actively fighting with your co-parent, that sounds like hell, right? And that's why I'm always careful with the compassion word too, because it's like, I don't want that. Right. But like, that's not my goal. I mean, if someone can get there and they want to get there, hallelujah. I think that's great. Yeah. But like literally us just being able to shift a little bit and develop more peace for ourselves, that's what's important. Yeah. People don't get divorced so they can be miserable for the rest of their lives. They get divorced because they think there might be like a better path for them. I help them get there sooner. Yeah.
Curious about step parents. I was just thinking as you were talking, like I know a lot of step parents who struggle with co-parenting as step parents. And is that something that you can support people with as well?
Yes. And so if you thought it was crazy for me to start a company with my ex-wife, how about with my ex-wife and my current wife? We are talking about this. Yeah. So right now my focus has been, just because I've really been up and running with this mainly, for the last 3 or 4 months, right now our focus is on working on those co-parenting stories. But I am actively working with my current wife on some like step family, blended family sort of stuff. And that's absolutely something that I help in coaching on. Turns out, to your point earlier, there's like a base set of tools that are applicable to a lot of different situations. The stuff that I'm teaching and coaching on in the Modern Coparent, initial courses is very much applicable to that. So there will be more coming out with my wife, although she's like, I don't want to be on video, but I'm going to see if I can change that. And, but yeah, so there will be lots of conversations about that, because my wife, I've been married, it'll be 10 years this year. Is that true? Yeah. Wait, yes. Right. Yes. Don't tell her I said that. But like that, it's been a while, and I've been divorced for 12. And so, we have a lot of experience with step parenting, and like both like step parenting and building up, having other kids, as well as my co-parent having relationships as well. And so, yeah, that's on the horizon of other courses and things. I want to provide resources. Right now we're providing resources for the divorced parent, but we're also working on developing resources for the step parent, the person that's coming into the family as well.
Yeah, because I presumably same story work, really stories around that. It's complicated sometimes. And but I've also seen so many cool situations where it's just amazing the way groups of people are, and like more than 2 or 3 people are co-parenting together,
Yep.
And it's really, it can be really amazing, I think, just from what I see, which is awesome.
The common thing is that people have to get out of their own way. Like egos get involved. There's a lot that, again, like, my daughter, Jane, calls my wife mom. And I remember when that first happened, and it happened when our son was born. So I had Jane with my ex-wife, and then I had our son Murray with my current wife. And so there was a little bit of a shift, right? Because like until then, Jane was kind of an only child. And, my co-parent was supportive of that. And it's funny, I think about that a lot. I think about like how much that really took for them to be okay with that. Like that title mom is like, it's a big friggin' deal, right? But not letting that sort of our stories around that sort of stuff get in our way is how people are able to, interact and co-parent as a group.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Oh my gosh. I have so many things that are coming into my head. I'm an adoptive parent, as you may or may not know. So my son's adopted. And I'm just thinking about through an open adoption, we have like a really wonderful relationship with my son's birth family, but it can get really complicated in open adoptions too, or in interfamilial adoptions, like so many aspects of parenting that really qualify as co-parenting, but not kind of the typical way we would think of the typical assignment that we would give to that word co-parent. And it feels to me like this type of work could just be so helpful for all of them. Not trying to put more stuff on your plate.
Oh, I love it.
Clearly got a lot of irons in the fire over there, which is awesome.
Honestly, like really, truly, like my goal is to help people who are in, we'll call it sort of untraditional parenting arrangements.
Yeah.
Whatever that happens to mean.
Yeah.
So it can mean like a divorced situation with 2 single parents, or like maybe one's remarried, or one's been remarried multiple times. Like the world's a crazy place, and there's so many different sort of arrangements out there. My goal is to give people the tools to make whatever arrangement they find themselves in as enjoyable and full of love and connection as possible, and to try to avoid some of the, frankly, really difficult and stressful and anger-inducing situations that we hear about all the time.
Yeah, that's great. Last question, maybe.
Yeah, keep going. I love it.
Well, what I'm curious about is, so, obviously not everybody's going to end up working with a coach. Some people will be able to work with you, which is awesome. But, we'll provide Scott's information in a sec for anyone who wants to learn more about where to find Scott. But for people who are just maybe, they're listening to this podcast and they're thinking like, that's me, or that's my sister, and I'm going to forward this podcast on for them to listen to, or whatever. For those people who are just in the beginning stages of this and it's really feeling like acute right now, how the pain, the conflict, the maybe toxicity of what's happening. What are some like tips for people that you can give now that might be helpful to start them on this path of change, stepping into, I call it personal responsibility. And then sometimes that sounds like I'm placing blame. I'm not at all, but just like, I feel like once we know that we can control something, then it's up to us, and there is some personal responsibility there. So what are some things that people can do to start kind of stepping into that and taking control over the bits that are actually within their control, which it would include, I guess, the stories that are keeping them in a place that doesn't feel great?
It's funny you should ask this question. I literally just wrote something that's going to be available soon, which is like 4 tips for feeling better now. Although that's kind of a lame title, so I might need to redo it. But yeah, it's really funny. Like, and I think personal responsibility actually really is the right term. Not in a blamey way, but just in a reality that like we're responsible for ourselves.
Right.
So the first thing that can be massively helpful is have someone to talk to, not a friend or family member that's just going to stoke the fire, not someone that's quote unquote on your side, but just having someone you can express how you feel to. That can go such a long way in letting you blow off some steam without creating a lot of emotional blowback or a lot of emotional problems, which then, translates to, you being mad and maybe not being the best co-parent or parent that you could be.
Right.
So that sounds really simple, but it's really massive. The second one is to, like we were talking about earlier, pay attention to what you're thinking. Like, I think it's a really magical thing that happens with awareness, in that like when we start to become aware of the fact that like, wow, I'm thinking all the time about how much I really hate this person, you start to notice that like you have those thoughts and you feel like shit. But then even just noticing that will help you kind of shift a little bit. So I always have people, make notes or like keep notes app on a phone of like, oh, I'm thinking this, I'm thinking that. Like, as you are able to do that, it's not necessarily going to fix it, but it'll at least help you be more aware of what's going on. And just that level of awareness can help you feel better.
Yeah. Is that, sorry, Scott. Is that what is it those repeated thoughts that give you the clues as to what the bigger story is?
Yes. So a lot of times I'm, if I do say so myself, pretty good at spotting those stories with people. But yeah, that is one of those things, is if you start to see, see those sort of repeated thoughts or language like she always does this, he always says this. That's a really clear like, oh, wait, there's something there. And I'm not even saying, and yeah, like that's one of the things that we do in the course is we kind of start taking those thoughts and we start looking at them and saying, what are the clues there? But again, even being aware of it, there's a really big impact. And I think you've probably experienced this before, when like you think a thought and it makes you feel like shit. And then there's a third thing that happens and you go, wow, that thought really made me upset. There is a space provided there where it doesn't take the pain away, but it makes it a little bit less intense. What the vast majority of people do is they have a thought, they feel of emotion, and they just follow it down the rabbit hole, right? They just go, they're just there, and there's no awareness. And this is not a knock on people. This is a human thing. Like this is how we operate. And so just being aware of it, again, it's not about solving the problem, but it can give you some space to breathe. And that's often what people need in these situations, especially with something as all-encompassing as divorce or co-parenting. And along those same lines, giving yourself an opportunity to process those thoughts and emotions, that's something else that like very often, and I get it, like we get divorced and we have kids and we have jobs, and then there's this whole other thing we got to work out, and this arrangement and who's going to live where, and like there's so many questions and there's so much uncertainty. And what is really common, and I know that I went through this, and I've pretty much everyone I've ever worked with that's gone through this process, we don't give ourselves an opportunity to like fully process those thoughts and emotions. Like, take 20 minutes out to do what you got to do. If you want to go get a punching bag and process that way, if you want to scream into a pillow, if you just want to sleep, if you just want to write, like very often we get so lost in the emotions and in the mix of emotions that exist that we don't actually fully process them. So even just from time to time, giving yourself some me time so that you can do that, that's massively helpful. Again, it doesn't fix the situation, but peace is created piece by piece, right? So like every little thing you do that gets you a little bit more peace is going to add up. And then the last thing, and this is really big, as you know, Wendy, like I'm a big fan of Stoic philosophy. And one of the biggest things that I learned from my study of that is this idea that the only thing that's worth focusing on is what we actually control. And, I hear people say things like, they're always this way, or if they just wouldn't do this, or if they just would do that. Like, we focus on, oh man, my co-parents taking them to Disney and I told them I wanted, like, there's so many things that we focus on that are outside of our control that it can drive us crazy. And to be honest with you, in a divorce or co-parenting situation, there's a lot of shit outside your control. As a matter of fact, in most households, about half the time, that stuff's out of your control.
Right.
And so another thing that can be helpful is reminding ourselves, wait, is this something that's in my control or not? And if it is, great, you can keep working on it. If it isn't, recognize that and try to let go. That can make a huge difference. And oftentimes it's that stuff that we can't control, that we have a lot of story around. And so I spend time working with people there. But those are really, really the biggies, and just starting to become aware of how this is happening, and maybe look at what you're trying to achieve, and where your focus is.
Yeah, I love all of that. I think that's so great. I'll often say to people, not specifically around co-parenting, but I think it would probably apply when people are in something that it's going to go on for a while, like whatever the thing is. It might be like, for example, supporting an ailing parent, or going through, for a lot of my clients, like going through menopause, perimenopause and menopause, or transitioning into, going through the last few years of your kids being home, knowing that they're going to leave the nest soon. And I'll often say something like, again, along the lines of like focusing in on what you can control in the situation versus what you can't control.
Yeah.
When you look back on this time, how do you want to have gone through it?
Yeah.
Like, what is important to you now about how you go through this? What's going to feel good to you when you look back on it? And then I find that helps people sort of ground themselves in some kind of, and I'm not really huge on the whole like intention, manifestation-y stuff. That's not what I'm talking about, but like true intention, how do I want to go through this, and what's important about how I go through this, and then trying to make decisions and respond from that place. It doesn't like, we're all human. You're still going to wig out sometimes and say things you wish you hadn't said and all of that. But I do find personally, it's been helpful for me. And I think it's kind of along the lines of what you're saying.
100%. And I one of the hard parts about any sort of big emotional process, and divorce is definitely that, or learning how to co-parent is definitely that, is this really big gap between how we want to show up and how we actually show up. Right.
Yeah.
In that gap, that's where stories are, right? That's where you can picture it in a way of like, the reason that gap exists is because of the stories that we have. And if we can start pulling those apart, if we can start working on those, then we can get closer and closer and closer to being that version of ourselves that we can look back on. And, I'll be honest with you. I look back on the first 5 years of my divorce, and I am not pleased with what I see in terms of the way that I showed up.
Yeah.
And I would bet money that my co-parent would say exactly this. Well, I know they would, because they have, and we've talked about it. But like, being able to say, all right, after that point, things started to get better. Like, that sort of perspective is incredibly, incredibly useful.
Right. Because of course you don't have the awareness, like you can't do better if you don't even know what's happening, and it's that moment of awareness. And then once you have that, and I mean, there are lots of parts of my life I look back on and wish I'd done things differently too. But I do love that. For me, it's been really helpful, that idea of like, once you know that there's something that's not feeling good for you, and especially if it's something that's going to last for a while, right? Like co-parenting is a lifetime journey. It's not something that's over in a short period of time. So what's going to make this feel good to you? And because that's the only part that's within your control. And I mean, obviously it's not the flip of a switch. It's a complicated thing, but I love everything that you've said today, Scott. It's got me thinking differently about some things. And I'm sure that for people who are listening to this, it's been incredibly, incredibly helpful. So I so appreciate you agreeing to come on and talk about this. As you might not know, well, you might not know this. You might know this. I have had, I think, a total of 3. You're my 3rd male guest. So awesome. You're part of a very small, very special club. I normally, and it's not there's no reason behind that, except for that. Right. I like to talk to women about women's problems, but this is I feel like this is such a great topic. And I honestly, Scott, like please take this as a compliment. I think it's so great that you are a male and you're doing this work. Because honestly, it's like, it's going to be, this is a generalization, but this is the type of work that normally a person might think that a female person with some estrogen might be more inclined to be doing. Yes. So I love that you're doing it.
I have a lot to say about that, but at the risk of not getting your podcast in trouble, but like, I feel like a lot of guys shy away from this stuff. And to be honest with you, this is where I really started getting into it. It was watching how other men were dealing with it or not dealing with it. I'm a real big believer in personal development, and I think a lot of the particularly I'll be critical of people, sure. A lot of the really male or centric personal development stuff is not very helpful. And so I really like it too, and being able to have these conversations, because there might be different issues or different perspectives between men and women, but the processes are the same. And the pain is very much the same. And I think being able to bridge that gap, and that's what I love. I work with moms and dads, by the way. I work with both. And that is really, really important, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think it's super cool. And I was really excited when you told me this was what you were doing now, and excited to have you on here to talk about it, because it's such a common thing. And I love talking about it with you, and with you as a male, but just with you as a human. I just think it's been really awesome. So thank you so much for coming on. Now, people want to find out more about Modern Coparent. Where do they go, Scott?
So it is modern-coparent.com. The website it's so funny. I've been so busy working with people and developing the stuff that I don't have a ton of info on there, but there is a contact form. And so I encourage people, I read and answer a lot of emails. People are really interested in this idea. So please reach out to me there. There'll be a lot more information coming there soon as well, including this guide that I kind of referenced, that's in the works. I hope I have that posted soon. And then I'm currently doing one-on-one clients with this work. And then shortly, I also hope to have some group stuff available as well, where people can really kind of go through this with other people that are in the same spot. So it's modern-coparent.com.
Perfect. I'll put that in the show notes, everyone, so you can go and grab it from there. Okay. Well, thanks again, Scott.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yes, you too. Take care.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a certified Naked Mind coach, I help busy women like you find freedom from alcohol. If you're starting to question your relationship with alcohol, you'll want to listen to my free 3-part video series where I address the top 3 myths around why you think you need to drink. Sign up now at www.wendymccallum.com/myths. That's www.wendymccallum.com/myths.